you. So welcome everybody. The Indigenous Health Research Cluster has nominated Dr. Dan Henhawk, who's here with us today, to be an Illuminate speaker. And I've only actually met Dan once in person in a Master of Sciences proposal defense. And but he had a big impact on me, so I'm excited to have him here today. So I'm the coordinator for the Indigenous Health Research Cluster, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are meeting on Aboriginal land, Treaty 1 territory, that is and has been inhabited by and cared for by Indigenous peoples from the beginning. And I'd like to acknowledge and thank the Anishinaabe, Cree, OG Cree, Dakota, Dene, the Métis, and the Inuit people for shaping and strengthening our communities. I'd like to acknowledge the atrocities of colonialism that have and continue to cause harm. And in particular, on our minds right now is the horrible legacy of residential schools that continues to be unveiled. Reconciliation requires meaningful relationships and partnerships. And so I'm pleased to have Dr. Dan Henhawk join us today. When I met Dan in the Master of Sciences proposal defense, his teaching on the importance of including oneself and positioning oneself within one's own research that is for or about Indigenous people, communities, and topics was impactful and something I continue to reflect on. In considering our college's goals of promoting health through physical activity, respiratory health, and meaningful activity, I imagine we have much to learn from his perspectives that aim to trouble modern Western conceptualizations of leisure using a critical Indigenous lens. So thank you, Dan, and I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks very much, Kara. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very honored to have been asked to speak today. I was also a little bit surprised with the nomination, but I'm, again, very happy to I guess, try and relate and share some of the work that I'm doing around leisure. I guess first and foremost, I'll introduce a little bit about myself. I am a Kanien'kehá person from the Six Nations of the Grand River. I put this picture up, or this map of Southern Ontario, just to give you something to look at. I think it's hopefully a little bit interesting for people to see where different people are located in the world, at least where I was located in the world. I did my degrees at the University of Waterloo in Recreation and Leisure Studies. So I sort of, I guess, consider myself situated within the field of leisure studies. And yes, that is a field within the academy. I've spent a lot of time, I guess, contemplating what leisure is, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But today I was going to, as I was trying to put this presentation together, I was trying to think about how do what do I discuss that sort of frames it for people who might not be interested or might not know much about the field of leisure studies, and then relate it to some of my work around, I guess, sport and recreation within the Indigenous context. So I'm actually going to draw upon some of my dissertation work that really started this whole process of thinking about leisure in relation to colonialism, and then maybe throw out some ideas that I have related to where I'm going next, and maybe we can hopefully have time for some discussion too to relate this to maybe some of the fields or the projects that you're currently involved with. I also put this slide up too, just to, I think, relate some of the uniqueness of Six Nations, given where we are located or where the community is located. And sort of the, I guess, the influences of various cultures. And this is not to say that other Indigenous communities or other parts of the world don't have influences, but our history and our community is quite unique in the sense that, I guess, our history in relation to colonialism goes back quite far. So we're talking before the Revolutionary War. And then it was the Revolutionary War that actually ended up dividing us, and that's why we ended up in Southern Ontario. So our people, the Haudenosaunee people, you would know the term Iroquois or Mohawk, were originally from New York State, anywhere from, say, the Rochester area through the Finger Lakes region all the way over to Albany and Schenectady, and then north into the Adirondacks. So those were, I guess, our original homelands, even though we have other stories of us coming from the Southwest as well. But those were the lands that we inhabited for quite a long time until I guess colonialism occurred. This is I guess a bit of a close-up of our community, our reserve, and you can clearly see the boundaries of the reserve here, demarcated by the forest that we have. I guess it's something to be a bit proud of, in the sense that we have the largest stand of Carolinian forests left in Southern Ontario. And for those of you who don't know, in Southern Ontario, particularly closer to Lake Erie and parts of Lake Ontario, we have a forest that's very similar to the Carolinas, just because of the type of climate that exists in Southern Ontario, and of course because of the migration of the birds. I put this up too because it's interesting, because you can see, I guess, some of the, if you want to think about development and agriculture and the things that have occurred through time, and you can see sort of, I guess, the lack of agriculture in our community, even though historically we were an agricultural society, as well as you can see sort of, some of the smaller urban centers that grew up around us. This is a picture of the original tract of land that was deeded to us in Southern Ontario by the British Crown. Obviously, there's lots of controversy as to whether or not the Brits had the right to give us or deed us that land, considering that there were other people who were living in this area. And certainly we could go on for hours about the reasons for this, but I just wanted to show you this because the question of land is quite important when we start discussing decolonization. And I think that where I'm heading with regards to my thinking around how to decolonize leisure, I'm more and more leaning towards, I think, trying to bring in discussions of land into this idea of decolonizing leisure, and trying to figure out how do we sort of unpack or dismantle it from sort of settler colonial understandings of what it is. This map here shows the original deed, which was 7 miles on either side of the Grand River from its mouth to its source. As you can see here, I guess the different communities that have popped up, over time, and then how sort of the land was sort of whittled away, and then we were left with that orange space in the bottom. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but there's a little block of land here at the bottom of a reserve here at the southern part. That's probably 4 concessions and then 1 concession right by the town of Hagersville. That's where the Mississaugas of the New Credit live. So if you can imagine, the Mississaugas basically inhabited this whole area of Southern Ontario, and they were essentially moved from their homelands around Lake Ontario to our portion of the reserve here. So just something to think about. So I think before we can have a discussion around leisure, I want to have a quick discussion around decolonization and what it means to me and what some of our more prominent Indigenous thinkers have written about it, as well as how do we think about decolonization in, I think, very general or broad terms. I don't think that it's been discussed as well as it could be, because it can seem a little bit overwhelming, particularly when we bring in the discussion of land. But I put up a quote here from Eve Tuck and Wang Yang, and perhaps some of you have come across this paper. It's called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. And I guess to tell you a quick story, I was at a conference last week where we were discussing, decolonizing the academy and how do we move forward, with types of leadership scholarship that we want to do. And the question of decolonization was posed, and this was prior to the conference, and we had a bit of a debate between myself and some of my colleagues. And it was posed to me that Eve Tuck's notion of decolonization was a radical idea, that it was something that is sort of on the fringes of sort of mainstream thinking around what decolonization is. And I got it kind of, it maybe rubbed me a little bit the wrong way, just because I think that that sentiment that it's a radical idea is coming from a position sort of of privilege where we can't imagine what it would be like to, I don't want to say give Indigenous lands back, but to make whole Indigenous peoples and their cultures by allowing Indigenous peoples to do on the land what it is that they want to do. And I guess my only retort to that discussion was that, well, if you were to think about 400 to 500 years ago, Indigenous peoples would never have been able to imagine what has happened to us now. So I think that it's a bit of a weak argument to argue that decolonization as a repatriation of Indigenous lands is not possible given the state of society that we have now with, population and urban centers and all those types of things. But then I as impossible as that might sound, I think thinking about giving Indigenous peoples lands Indigenous peoples their lands back also comes from a settler colonial mindset in the idea that there's this idea of ownership. And I don't really think that that's what Eve and Wayne are talking about. Really, what they're talking about is the ability to be self-determined and to have sovereignty over how we want to engage with the land, which, given the reserve system, it didn't work out the way that governments had foreseen. So, I mean, if you get a chance to check out that article, I would highly recommend it if you're wanting to extend your thinking around decolonization. She points out that it's not a metaphor in this discussion as well, that, she writes, it's not a metaphor for the other things that we want to do to improve our societies or schools. There's a decolonizing discourse, which includes decolonizing our schools, using decolonizing methods, trying to decolonize student thinking. All of that turns decolonization into a metaphor, which then does not focus on the issue of land. And the problem with that is that a lot of these, I guess, well, she writes, critical methodologies, initiatives around social justice. A lot of these things might actually be incommensurable with decolonization because it still maintains this relationship between sort of the settler colonial state and the Indigenous peoples, and sort of this, subservient relationship that there is between our ways of knowing and our ways of being within this context of Canada and the United States. And so then she writes, the metaphorization of decolonization makes possible a set of evasions or settler moves of innocence that problematically attempt to reconcile settler guilt and complicity and rescue settler futurity. And I wholeheartely agree with that. And I think, though, we still have to talk about decolonization or decolonizing in relation to things like the land. But we also have to think about things like leisure, which we're going to talk about today, because leisure cuts to the core of how we actually are in the world. How we engage, how we think about and how we engage in leisure speaks to the type of, speaks to the ways that we live in the world, that then speaks to our relationship to things like the land. So there are many different ways to think about leisure. If you're not a scholar of leisure, that's okay. But I would say most prominently within our field, we draw upon various classical views of leisure. There were, ancient Greek and Roman philosophers like Aristotle and Plato who talked about leisure. and related it to notions of the contemplative life, and the contemplative life being sort of that highest form of human existence that people were striving for. The problem with that is, though, that most of those philosophers had the time to live the contemplative life because of the servant or slave society in which they lived. So that idea of human existence and moving towards this sort of idyllic notion of living a contemplative life doesn't really exist when the realities of survival and work come into play. But some of those philosophies still hold true in terms of how we think about leisure. And if you spend enough time, you can sort of relate it to, again, how we think about work, how we think about our relationships to each other, and how we think about time. So I think most commonly people think about leisure as an activity, or as a bunch of activities. So the things that you go and you do, or either some type of intrinsic motivation or for some type of fun. We also think of it in terms of time. So if we want to compartmentalize our lives, we can think about our leisure time as opposed to our work time, as opposed to our family time. Certainly that gets a bit more complicated when you start putting in ideas around meaning and enjoyment and motivation. You could argue that you have separations between time, but you could also argue that maybe your work becomes your leisure if it's intrinsically motivating. And if it becomes your leisure, then how does it mesh with this other notions of leisure? And does it actually roll into one? And does your work actually become your leisure? Obviously, there's no consensus on that, but these are just theories and ideas around how we can conceptualize what leisure is. But nonetheless, it has great importance in terms of how we think about work, or how we think about leisure, which is then related to how we think about work and productivity. A lot of this stems from the Industrial Revolution, particularly in North America. It was highly informed by puritanical and Protestant viewpoints about how to be in the world. As a result, there is a huge undercurrent of Christianity and Christian values that are entangled with how we sort of view ourselves and how we're supposed to be in the world. And we can see all of those historical values coming into the present with the ways that we organize ourselves around time, how we think about work, how we think about productivity, how do we think about progress and modernity, and all those types of things. But there are, I guess, two main thoughts that are driving me and driving my work, both for my dissertation and in the present moment, is how do we decolonize leisure? If we were to take the arguments of decolonization seriously, what would that look like? What would it mean for something like leisure? And then also, what are there, or are there decolonizing leisures that would help with this process? For me, much of that discussion comes back to the land and how we as human beings interact with it and how we think about it, about how we are in the world in relation to the land and to our other relations. So this journey began a long time ago for me. I really didn't really understand it until I decided to go back and do my master's. And it was through my master's and my PhD process that I guess I had a bit of an awakening related to how I was colonized in my own coloniality, how I was complicit in colonization in so many different ways. And part of this was driven by my reading of Linda Tuiwei-Smith's discussion of decolonizing methodologies. I highly recommend that book if anyone has not read it. Even if you can get a copy of it and read the intro and the first two chapters, I would hope that those first two chapters are something that really meant a lot for me in terms of expanding my mind around what colonization was, and how it relates to the experience of Indigenous peoples. He writes that the reach of imperialism into our heads challenges those who belong to colonized communities to understand how this occurred, partly because we perceive a need to decolonize our minds, to recover ourselves, and to claim a space in which to develop a sense of authentic humanity. That very small passage there really, I guess, resonated with my experience. Because once I start to understand what colonization was, I start to understand how it was sort of insidious in all the different things that I was involved with. And for me, sport was particularly important to my life and to the lives of my family, as well as the lives of my friends and my community. And so a lot of my work revolved around, I think, trying to understand how it was that we were colonized through our sport experiences. Which then, for me, being a leisure studies student, led to a much larger question of sort of how notions of leisure are connected to, I guess, the various ways in which sport was colonizing Indigenous peoples, which again relates to all the things I just mentioned, related to work and different values around how to be in the world. So this is me. I don't know how old I was, maybe 3 or 4 years old. One of the questions that I had was, how does a little Indian boy from Southern Ontario become a Montreal fan in the heart of Leaf Nation? My mom was a diehard and still is a diehard Canadiens fan. She will hang up on me if I don't let her go watch the hockey game, but she made sure that all of us were Montreal Canadiens fans in our family, except for my dad. He kind of helped supported us, but he was also, I think, a Detroit Red Wing fan at heart. But it does speak to a lot of influences of culture, right? And how does culture get transferred to people? And for me, that's through the narratives and stories that we know and we understand. So my work was around trying to understand the narratives around sport that people had, and to try and tease out some of the tensions that I was seeing in relation to my understanding of colonization and what people were telling me about their understandings of sport. I was really hoping that I could maybe hear some stories about our traditional ways of knowing sport or leisure, but then I realized that we don't have those because our understandings of sport and our understandings of leisure, which were much more different for a number of different reasons, and we'll get there in a second. This is the Six Nations Parks and Recreation, complex. Again, I just sort of put these up here for interest so that people can sort of have something to look at. You can see our new community hall right in the center there with our new gymnasium. To the left of that complex is our arena. We've had that since 1972. In the background, you can see a new rubberized running track, which was put in, I think, around 2012, 2013. And then some field lacrosse pitches, which is interesting because we don't actually play field lacrosse at Six Nations. There is some people, there's some teams that are starting to grow, but mostly we've played box lacrosse at Six Nations. You can see we have an outdoor summer rink for rollerblading and roller hockey. We have a splash pad and we have a skateboard park as well. I think what's interesting about this is the more and more I look at it and more I think about it, this is I think a reflection of sort of modern colonialism and the types of ideas that we have around what constitutes a recreation department and the types of facilities and sports that we should be engaging in, which again speaks to, I think, a certain mindset, right, about how as a community and as people, the types of things that we are interested in and the types of things we think that we should be doing. And that has a long history, particularly when you look at this picture. And if you know some of the history around how our communities in Canada developed, you will know, the connections to things like agricultural exhibitions, horse racing. You can't see it in this picture, but there used to be an old community hall to the right of the horse track here. And that hall was built off of monies that were given to the community specifically for agricultural exhibitions. Because part of the colonial process was getting Indigenous peoples to engage in agriculture the way that Europeans thought that we should be engaged in agriculture, even though particularly for the Haudenosaunee people, we were engaged in agriculture for centuries before that. But we were, had to get with the program and start having our monocrops and our big fields of agriculture that everyone wanted to have at that time. As a result, though, particularly in Southern Ontario, and I'm sure this is the same for a lot of different places in Canada, but you won't find very many small communities without a community hall or an agriculture hall and a horse track. And there's a lot of different, discussions we can have around horse racing as a form of leisure and the values that were driving the reasons why that was such a popular form of leisure, which then we can relate to discussions around, burgeoning ideas of capitalism and gambling and all those types of things. There's certainly a whole discourse around gambling as well in relation to Indigenous peoples, where our forms of gambling, I guess, our forms of games were not acceptable in the same way that things like horse racing were, because it was, something that was regulated by settler society. And then you can see our ball diamonds, our softball diamonds. Certainly softball has a long history as well. And these diamonds were created probably around the 1930s, 1940s. They originally were dirt diamonds, and then it wasn't until maybe the early 90s that we put in grass. Anyway, just something for you to chew on, to think about as we move forward with this discussion. One of the, I guess, scholars that I draw upon for my work is Karen Fox. She wrote a really good paper around leisure and Indigenous peoples. And she writes that although Eurocentric leisure is obviously relevant within a modern and globalized world, the use of this category for understanding the worldview of Indigenous peoples risks appropriating and deforming Indigenous knowledges and practices. So not only was a European or Eurocentric lens used to understand and then categorize Indigenous cultures, it was also used as a means of sort of reunifying Eurocentric ways of being in the world. This, coupled with ideas related to work and productivity, progress and modernity, certainly all played a part in the colonial project that had very devastating effects for Indigenous cultures, and any cultures really that had different or opposing viewpoints of how to be a human being in the world. The influence, I guess, of these perspectives can be seen in the overt acts of violence, the removals of Indigenous peoples, putting Indigenous peoples on reserves. This is also evidenced by the residential school systems. Certainly we can see it from the evidence from the residential school survivors, and most recently the discovery of children's bodies in BC. And one thing I want to just throw in there too is I think people forget that this is not the first time that they found bodies at a residential school, but maybe because this, discussion is more at the forefront of public discourse, that this is why it's gaining so much prominence. I would invite you to sort of do your own research to find the other instances of where bodies have been found. I guess the other thing I want to mention too about the residential school system, and there's been some great work done by Janice Forsyth around this, around the history of introducing Eurocentric sports and games to the Indigenous children of these schools. And then sort of the very nuanced, I guess, discussion around how, yes, it was utilized as a form of oppression of Indigenous children as a way of disciplining their bodies, but then also how Indigenous children then utilize some of those games and sports to try and survive their experiences, which I think, speaks to, again, sort of the very complicated and contradictory relationship that Indigenous peoples have with sports and games. you will not find an Indigenous community that does not enjoy engaging in hockey or lacrosse, particularly here back in the East. You won't find many communities who don't enjoy playing softball or basketball. But yet there's lots of tensions within that, because again, when you look at the history of how these sports were either introduced or how communities took up those sports, there's a lot of questions around how then that participation maintains sort of neo-colonial notions of what it means to be in the world. I think, as you can see here from this picture, this is a picture of the Six Nations Mohawks. My mother is in this picture. I guess maybe I'll give a prize to the winner at the end of this talk to guess which one she is. This is from the 1958, 1959. And as you can see, there's a lot of tensions within this picture. Certainly from a Canadian perspective, from a settler colonial perspective, you could say, wow, look at all these women, these Indigenous women. They are playing softball. They are engaged in sport. They are doing the types of things that we really want to see Indigenous women doing. And given that this was the late 1950s, that's an even greater achievement, which certainly it was. But I think now that if we were to throw a critical Indigenous lens on something like this, we can certainly see, I think, the influences of culture on these women. And we have to ask the question then, how did something as seemingly simple like softball sort of influence who they were as people? We can certainly see it in their clothing. We can certainly see it in the way they cut their hair, the types of glasses that they're wearing. I suppose you could even make the argument you could see it in the way that they're standing. When we look at the discussion around introducing Eurocentric games and sports to residential school children, much of that was around ensuring that children towed the line in terms of how they stood and how they acted, how they actually engaged in movement. So you can maybe make the argument that, particularly for those who are sort of standing at attention with their arms by their sides and making sure that they are looking, proper for the camera. So 3 main issues, I guess, have driven my work and my research. One is the relationship between leisure and the historical colonization of Indigenous peoples. The second is the relationship of leisure to neo-colonialism and the ongoing oppression of Indigenous peoples in the present. And then the relationship of leisure to the struggles of Indigenous peoples who are struggling to realize their own understanding of sovereignty and self-determination in the present. There are certainly lots of ways that leisure continues to perpetuate ongoing neo-colonialism. Sport is particularly one of the easiest and best examples of this, particularly if it's evaluated critically for the values that are explicitly taught within sport, but also for those things that have been normalized within sport that we don't give much thought to, such as competitiveness, win at all cost mentalities, notions around dedication and progress, and certainly notions around hypermasculinity that then lead to all the other forms of sort of xenophobic violence towards race and gender. Specifically, the purpose of my work for my dissertation was to look at the tensions that surround leisure and sport in Six Nations. So I interviewed 3 of our community leaders who were heavily involved in sport and recreation. And I was looking again at their stories and their understandings of sport within the community. And I was also, it was also to convey the struggles that I was experiencing, which I still experience to this day, of trying to understand my own indigeneity and the connections between sort of these understandings and the influences of leisure. The actual research that I engaged in, for those of you who are interested in the research side of things, Sean Wilson, I think, heavily influenced how I think about research. He talks about strategies of inquiry. Because again, if we were to talk about Western sort of ontologies and epistemologies and methodologies, those are all very problematic in relation to Indigenous knowledges and Indigenous communities. But that's not to say that some of them aren't useful for, I think, helping Indigenous peoples to engage in research that then also supports our ways of knowing. So he mentioned strategies of inquiry versus methodologies as a means to denote the idea that you can draw upon various methodologies to help inform how you do your research. You could draw upon qualitative methods like, maybe some, well, for me, it was storytelling and narrative inquiry. You could maybe do some performance ethnography or ethnographies in there to try and help draw out some of the tensions in the things that we're looking at. So I engaged in what he calls talk story with my participants or the people in my community. Basically, talk story is similar idea of a sharing circle where you allow people to sort of talk freely. Sharing circles are a little bit more formal though, because there's usually a process and maybe a ceremony that goes along with that. Whereas talk story is the idea that you're sharing knowledge through the stories that you know. And that's what we try to do, even though it sort of still went back into sort of a discussion related to people's understandings. I was hoping for tell people to tell me just story after story, but that's obviously not how we converse in day-to-day life. I also used critical self-reflexive writing, and so as Kara mentioned, this is quite important to me. I think that every scholar should engage in some type of critical self-reflexive writing because, we can have the debate between sort of positivist and post-positivist understandings of how to do research, but I do think it's important, and particularly with Indigenous peoples, that researchers really have a sense of their own positionality and why that they're engaging in Indigenous research. So I was writing to critically analyze my positionality, which is looking at my experiences and my perspectives and values, and then writing to situate myself within the text rather than striving to take myself out of it and be a third-party observer. I think it's important because then again, it allows people to see where one is coming from and the types of values that you're bringing towards your analysis of information, as well as then I think being very clear about how you see the world. And then that leads as a jumping off point to greater discussion, rather than having sort of a top-down perspective on how to think about Indigenous knowledges or Indigenous experiences. This is a very short quote from one of my participants. I hate saying my participants, but one of the people that I was working with. And to me, this quote, I think, sums up some of the fragmentation and the tension around the knowledge we have related to our cultural understandings of leisure, but then also our understandings of how sport actually perpetuates notions of coloniality. I think the really interesting quote here is that the person says, I don't know how it would have evolved in terms of our minor sports system. But then again, there's that connection of, I don't know how you would say it. It's that colonization maybe, because we key in on our hockey. We key in on, lacrosse, but softball is there too. We're looking at other sports, maybe soccer will eventually happen in our community, but there's also hockey and softball. So for me, there's a real disconnect around being able to articulate the place of sport in communities. And again, its connection to things like colonization and its connection to broader discussions around leisure. And if we don't have the ability to articulate that, then how can we ever fight it? And for me, sport being so prominent in Indigenous communities, I think it's one of the things that we really have to think about in terms of engaging in whatever sphere that we engage in, whether it's kinesiology or rehab sciences or therapeutic recreation. These are very, very important issues that very often we don't really think are very important because we maybe lump those things into leisure, or we lump those things into games or sports. So looking towards the future, I think we have to recognize the connections between leisure and colonialism, the attitudes that we have related to, and the perspectives that we bring to looking at particularly Indigenous people's experiences, but then also maybe self-reflecting it back on settler colonial society to say how are these activities that we engage in on a day-to-day basis, how do those maintain our own coloniality, our position within colonialism? And I think part of that is also the recognition that colonialism is more than the overt. It always has been. When you think about the different wars, the removals of Indigenous peoples, the appropriation of Indigenous lands, the subjugating us to reserves, the creation of the residential school systems, the policies enacted to ban our customs, all these types of things, those were the overt examples of colonialism. But behind it were mindset and values that drove those things, those actions. And we have to understand that those things are more insidious and they're more covert. And we have to understand how leisure, particularly, is complicit in this, in maintaining colonizing narratives about Indigenous peoples and their leisure choices. And I think that will lead to us, help us to lead to a point where we can then address institutional racism and discrimination. But that's only a first step, because it's complicated by the inherent coloniality of these institutions and systems, which were then driven by certain mindset and values. Again, broader picture, we have to connect these things to ideas around work, ideas around leisure, and our relationship to land. Particularly problematic for Indigenous peoples is capitalism and neoliberalism. These pose significant challenges to Indigenous values and philosophies. They pose significant challenges to realizing a measure of sovereignty and self-determination. And they do not allow us to put into practice an Indigenous way of being, and which we can then connect to sport and leisure, and then how sports and leisure, again, perpetuates that certain state of being. So for me, as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm moving towards a place where I think when we think about land and we think about decolonization, land is becoming so much more important, particularly in this time of climate change and, very increasing examples of xenophobia. I relate a lot of that to having a lack of relationship to the land. And that's what Indigenous peoples and Indigenous elders have been arguing for a very long time, that unless we are willing to decolonize our minds and decolonize things like leisure, we then have this, unless we're willing to do that, then we're going to be stuck in this sort of same cycle. But if we start looking at the land and think about our relationship to it, how then does that open up our new possibilities of how to relate and be a human being in the world, which maybe aren't necessarily new ways of being, but they're ways of being that can help us to think differently about how to be in the world. And just one other note, Indigenous peoples didn't have words for leisure. And there's a number of reasons for this. One is our languages, really didn't, depending on the culture, didn't sort of compartmentalize things that way. But as an example, I had a colleague of mine explain to me about the Mohawk language, which is my language, but I don't know. But he said to me, our languages were verb-based. They looked at items and they gave it an action, or they gave it a spirit, or they gave it, a use. And really changes, I think, how you see the world if you start thinking about verbs instead of nouns, right? And I guess I would hope that maybe that changes your perspective on how we think about Indigenous knowledges, but then also how we think about leisures. What is its purpose? How does it fit in things like rehab sciences or therapeutic recreation? How does it fit into kinesiology? How does that change in mindset about how we think about words and stories relate to how we think about being in the world? So that's it for right now. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I would certainly enjoy some discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have one question in the chat. We've got about 10 minutes, I'd say, for questions and discussion. And Barb just put in, we had a lot of examples of colonized sport that's being done, and she was wondering about, wondering a little bit more about the traditional activities that would have been done in that region, if you know that.
Well, for the Haudenosaunee people, our lives revolved around our agriculture and ceremony. So everything sort of was an offshoot, I guess, of that. It's a very poor choice of words, but our values around our relationship, this notion of, I guess, Indigenous relationality, which unfortunately I didn't get a chance to talk to in the talk, but this notion of relationality, I think, was front and center of how we engaged in the world. That then, I think, drove the types of activities that we engaged in. So things that maybe were categorized or perceived as games and sports by Europeans didn't have the same meaning for us. So things like lacrosse, for example, it was, from what I understand, it was more ceremonial. It was something that was done at certain points of the year, or it was done in relation to, you know, healing for the community. It might have been done in relation to trying to solve some type of dispute. But lacrosse was a sport that connected to our creation story. And within our creation story, there were values and philosophies that informed how we should be in the world. So when you take that perspective and then look at the different activities that maybe we engaged in, so we had a number of different things like snow snake, which is also done here in Manitoba, various other games of, you know, dexterity and things that sort of help you to live on the land, you know, those types of activities, you know, were quite prominent. Again, because it reflected the situation that we were in, right? But then everything else was then maybe more ceremonial. So dancing and music and storytelling, you know, that all reflected more of our relationship to the land rather than relationship to this idea of leisure. Because there was the idea that everything was connected, doing those things also meant that you were honoring those relations that we have, particularly in relation to our foods and to the world, right? So I'm sure there's a lot of information out there about, you know, specifically what types of things we engaged in, but I would encourage people to think about it more around the philosophies that we had around the earth and the environment and the world, and then what types of activities grew out of those philosophies.
Thanks. I'm just going to keep going with the questions in the chat. So we've got 4 or 5 there, and I'm just going to go in order. Someone wants to know your opinion on the Northern Games and its role in colonization and decolonization, or rather than and. Mm-hmm.
Well, the Northern Games, I think, is similar. It's a similar discussion related to any type of sporting event that's happening in the Indigenous context. There's no right or wrong to it, because they certainly have meaning for the community, and particularly the Northern Games, because they're more reflective of traditional games that the Inuit and Dene peoples engaged in. Again, the challenge, though, is maybe not to look at the activities themselves as being good or bad, So for example, I would never critique softball as being a bad sport, but it's more around the values that are perpetuated through those activities, and then how things like traditional games are then engaged in. So the Northern Games, I think, is a good thing in the sense that it's allowing Indigenous communities to engage in those activities. But then you have to ask the question about how is their engagement in those games reflective of more settler colonial values, or even modern Canadian or American values around what it means to engage in sports and games. The Northern Games particularly, like there's competitions around, who is the best and who can win, right? Certainly that's not the only values driving those activities, but there's certainly something that I think that could be critiqued. Because I don't know, certainly competitiveness is something that I think is endemic to all human societies, but again, competitiveness from an Indigenous perspective, again, always revolved around our perspectives and values related to the land. So understanding those games, I think, and understanding whether they have a purpose in modern Indigenous contexts is really about sort of trying to unpack, the tensions between sort of modernity and notions of progress and productivity and work and competition versus more traditional values that relate to Indigenous notions of relationality.
The next question on the chat is from Mariette, and I apologize if I pronounced your name wrong. Did you want to ask it yourself, or?
I could. Thank you very much, Dan, for sharing your work and your thoughts today. And this is probably this may not be an appropriate question. I always want to look at the practical side, and I was just struggling with maybe if it's possible to give an example of how this work might actually change the ways that Indigenous people engage with sports and leisure. So, forgive me if it's an unfair question.
No, I think it's a great question because, again, it speaks to, engaging in an activity that speaks to one's value set. And from my perspective, Indigenous people's engagement in something like sport, particularly, it's laden with these tensions, right? There's contradictions abound in Indigenous people's participation in sport. Because on one hand, you're buying into the dominant discourses around what sport is supposed to be. But then on the other hand, you're trying to think about, what is the indigeneity or what is the Indigenous values that I bring to this sport? The North American Indigenous Games, I think, is a good example of that, where they're engaging in sports and they're certainly perpetuating certain values around sport, but then at the same time, they're trying to bring in sort of cultural elements, though. But that's more at a very superficial level, though. The sports aren't reflective of their values. They're actually trying to infuse values into those sports, but at the same time, it's still very problematic, right? It still perpetuates the same thing. So, I think, how it will change the way Indigenous peoples engage in sports if they come to a more, I think, critical consciousness around this. It could lead to maybe on an extreme end, Indigenous peoples not just refusing to engage in sport, and then finding other activities to engage in. But then on a more practical level, maybe thinking about sport in different ways. Maybe taking out the competition in sports, taking out notions of winning and accolades and those types of things, and looking at more Indigenous ways of being in relation to those things. But then you always have to bring in those discussions related to the land. So it's a huge challenge, right? Because again, we're living in this time where, Indigenous cultural resurgence is on the increase, but climate change is also on the increase, and we all have to figure out different ways of being in the world. And sport and recreation and leisure, I think, is part of that. Until we can sort of, all of us, think differently about how to engage in these things and how to bring in more values related to the land, then we're going to continue perpetuating the same thing.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So it's 5-1, and I know some people will want to get going, but there's only one question left in the chat. And Nikki, who asked it, apologies if needed for pronunciation, asked it, and she's still here. So she wanted to hear your thoughts on the privatization of provincial parks and its potentially colonialist behavior.
Yeah, I think, that's exactly right, Nikki. I think that's part and parcel of the ongoing colonial project, right? The ongoing project of global capitalism to ensure that every piece of land is owned in some shape or form, to then get rid of the public sphere and notions of, I guess, collective ownership or collective rights to land. That, I think, goes back a long way too, if you want to look at some of the history related to Indigenous peoples and the removal of Indigenous peoples to reserves. So particularly in the United States, and I think in Canada too, there was legislation around once Indigenous peoples were removed from their homelands and then put on these reserves, there was legislation to create to ensure that they then took up the ideas of private property ownership. So the reserves at one point were communally held and communally owned, so to speak, quote unquote. But at some point, the governments, the powers that be, said, well, no, that's not good enough. We need Indigenous peoples to understand the value of private property ownership. And so they enacted these laws where Indigenous peoples then were able to, I think, gain some wealth and gain some status as long as they took up the idea of owning a property. And then that also related to, their blood quantum and all that type of crap. I see this privatization of provincial parks as sort of on the similar lines, right? It's the crushing of, communal ideas of relationship to land, where land just becomes a commodity. It just becomes something to sell and something for people to create wealth off of. So, we have huge challenges. We have massive, massive challenges if we're going to overcome some of these ideas that are really oppressive to not only Indigenous peoples, but to just the idea of being a good human being.
I'd like to extend my gratitude to Dan for joining us today and for sharing your thoughts on such a complex topic, your deep thinking that you've been doing and sharing of yourself within that thinking. And much gratitude for joining us, and much gratitude for everyone coming today to hear Dan's thoughts. So
great. Thanks very much, everyone. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Jay, and thanks, Lisa. You did get your messages, yeah.
The applause is thunderous.
Thanks, Dan.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks, Gail.